text today comes from Psalm 105, verses 1 through 6, and then verses 16 through 22. Give thanks to the Lord and proclaim his greatness. Let the whole world know what he has done. Sing to him, yes, sing his praises. Tell everyone about his wonderful deeds. Exult in his holy name. Rejoice, you who worship the Lord. Search for the Lord and for his strength. Continually seek him. Remember the wonders he has performed, his miracles and the rulings he has given. You children of his servant Abraham, you descendants of Jacob, his chosen ones. He called for a famine on the land of Canaan, cutting off its food supply. Then he sent someone to Egypt ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with fetters and placed his neck in an iron collar. Until the time came to fulfill his dreams, the Lord tested Joseph's character. Then Pharaoh sent for him and set him free. The ruler of the nation opened his prison door. Joseph was put in charge of all the king's household. He became ruler over all the king's possessions. He could instruct the king's aides as he pleased and teach the king's advisors. Praise the Lord. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Amen. When we consider the story of Joseph, it's a tale that fascinates us. It's a story of a favored son who's hated by his brothers, who then goes through years and years of degradation and humiliation, being made a slave, being falsely accused of rape, being put in prison, having hope he's going to get out only to be dashed, and resulting in the salvation of his family and of God's people because of that. The scriptures speak of Joseph as one of God's favored servants. Not sure I want to be classified as one of God's favored servants if this is what it takes. If you get humiliated and thrown into prison and falsely accused and your family hates you, you get all of this as part of God's favored servant, the two don't seem to go together. And yet, so often, what we resent, what we think is so awful, what we do not want to walk through, is what we need in order to accomplish the greater purposes that God has for our life. You know, with age sometimes comes a bit more wisdom. You can't convince my kids of this. My two boys, when they got old enough to vote, told me, why can't we vote when we're 16? We can drive when we're 16. Why can't we vote? And why can't we run for president? Why do we have to wait till we're 35? I know just as much about that the president does. And of course, we adults hear that kind of statement and we just kind of laugh. In fact, we think probably 35 is way too young to be president. I read an article this past week in the newspaper that in the Silicon Valley, once you're 30, you're considered over the hill for all these tech companies. People in their 30s and 40s and even into their 50s conceal their ages when they look for jobs because they know that they're not even going to be looked at if they're not in their 20s. And it used to be that these tech companies would sort of get things going, and then they would hit a certain point and they would go, okay, now we need to bring on an older hand, somebody in their 40s or 50s who has management and business executive experience, and kind of take us to the next level. And now even that's starting to disappear. Youth does not always value experience, and yet those of us on the other end of the journey, looking back, recognize how much we can do now that we never could have done years ago. That we now understand things, we now can look back at things, we now can put things into place that we simply didn't have the life experience, the wisdom, or the knowledge. And we accept that for ourselves when we're dealing with those whippersnappers trying to tell us, how the world ought to be. But we struggle to accept that when it comes to our spiritual life and our spiritual experiences and the hardships of life. Not recognizing that God is always faithful. It says that Joseph suffered as God developed his character. If Joseph had come into that power when he first arrived, he would have been a tyrant. He would have been arrogant. He would have been somebody that was a terrible ruler. But because he had been tempered, because he had been tested and refined, and because he had learned to accept humility, he made a far better leader. Someone who could actually save the Egyptian people and save his family. Had his brothers shown up shortly after they had sold him over to Egypt, and he had been in a position of power, it would not have been a gracious response. It would not have been a response of forgiveness. It would have instead been vindictiveness and vengeance. And so often, we feel that we've been betrayed. We feel that we're suffering. We feel that something in our life is not going right. And we have a hard time seeing that God is in the midst of it. That God is taking the bad and moving it into the good for us. Now, this is not to say that God sends all the bad stuff into your life. He doesn't. We make choices. Other people make choices. Sometimes things happen that God wouldn't say, oh, that's a good thing. But what he does say is, I can make good out of this. That's why the scriptures tell us, give thanks not for all things, give thanks in all things. In other words, we can look at whatever situation we're in, and we can say, God, I want to thank you that you are doing something in my life. I may not even see it yet. I may not understand it. But I know that you will bring good. I know that you will develop something in me. I know that you are faithful to be with me no matter what the circumstance. This was what Joseph had to do. Joseph had to be tested and refined. God had a plan. God was going to use him. But he also knew that Joseph was not ready until a certain point. This is a difficult thing for us. Sometimes the promise seems delayed. Can you imagine how Joseph felt? We didn't read all of the story, but if you remember, Joseph had a number of dreams. Dreams of the rest of the family bowing down to him. Well, that didn't go over well with Dad. It certainly didn't go over well with the brothers. And in fact, the brothers hated and despised him because of it. Yet he had this dream, and he was certain that God had spoken. He was certain that this was his destiny in life. Have you ever had that? You feel certain that you're supposed to do something. You feel certain that God is asking you and leading you. And then life intervenes. And you wonder, what am I supposed to do with that? Did I mishear? Did I miss something? Where are you, God? Joseph certainly had to question those dreams sitting in a prison cell. Joseph certainly had to question those dreams as his brothers betrayed him, threw him into a pit, hauled him up, and instead of rescuing him, sold him, his own blood, sold him into slavery. That's indeed what they said. Let's kill him and see what come of his dreams. Joseph probably was saying the same thing. What happened to my dreams? God, where are you? How can this be right? How can this be? And yet, God never left him. And God was faithful, and God blessed him as he was faithful. As Joseph, the story is unfolded in Genesis, Joseph faithfully served his master and was so favored that he became the number one guy in the household just below the master. He had free reign. He had a life. He had responsibilities. He had a great deal of freedom. He was still technically a slave, but the reality was he was treated as an honored person, at least until the wife intervened and betrayed him. And even in the prison, he was so faithful in prison that the prison master turned over the prison to Joseph and said, hey, you're doing a good job. Take care of things. Over and over, God helped and favored him, but it was because Joseph was willing to be faithful to what he knew was right and to walk in humility. Are we willing to walk in humility? Are we willing to walk through the suffering, trusting that God has a plan, trusting that God will bring good? Because contrary to what you might see if you flip on certain television channels with certain evangelists, life is not all about happiness and prosperity. We are not promised a life with no pain. And any preacher who says that there's no suffering in the Christian walk is lying to you. Because the truth is, we all suffer. We all go through hard times. We all go through disaster. We all go through things that we despair in. We all face situations and relationships where we wonder, God, I'm not seeing this. I'm not seeing you move here. I'm not seeing the hope. And yet, the promise of Jesus Christ is, I am always with you. I am always with you. I am indeed in control. We look at our own lives. We look at things like we saw yesterday. It's unfathomable to me that anybody, would get in a car and seek to run people over simply because of the color of their skin. That's evil. Pure and simple. Evil. And that is tragic. And that is now at least 3 families suffering because of that evil. How do you look at God and say, you took my loved one? And the truth is that evil and suffering and pain are difficult to deal with. But God's big enough to take it. He's big enough for us to be honest as to how we feel. He's big enough for us to be honest as to where we feel lost and abandoned and betrayed. And He's still with us. He still loves us. He doesn't say to us, oh, shut up. Instead, He says, I feel your pain. I know it's real. I know you're suffering. And I care about you. And I will take you through. And I will bring good even in the midst of evil. I didn't want this person to die. I didn't want this tragedy to unfold, but I can and will bring positive out of it. If you trust me, if you work with me, if you live with me. And so all across this country, there are people who are standing up and saying, that's not my country. That's not who we are. That's not what we're going to allow. And that is a good thing. It's terrible that it takes a tragedy like that for us to say it. But thank God people are saying it. Thank goodness that there are people of faith who are standing up and saying, that's not my faith. And that is one of the ways in which God begins to weave and restore and redeem. When the people of God stand up and say, no matter what happens, no matter what evil has transpired, my faith is not in others, my faith is in God. My faith is in you, Lord, that even in the midst of tragedy, even in disaster, even when things are going horrible in my life and in the lives of my community and around me, I can still trust you. I can still know that you are with me. And I can still know that I can praise and thank you, God, because you will bring me through. May God's presence be so real to us as we seek to be with him.